Hello, today we'll be doing this passage on Witness the Pain. It's a great passage on how people respond to losing their loved ones, how they turn grief into grievance, as mentioned here, and how they turn into activists for the method they lose their loved ones. So, let's move on. Uh, Today I filled out our US Census form. The date are not counted. My girl does not count. I suppose that's why I must make her count somehow. Now that I've failed my job of keeping her alive, of growing her up, my job is now to make her short life mean something. This is the work of the bereaved parent, I suppose. Our drive to keep going is really our desire to do our children's unfinished work. So the author is sharing her account of how she felt when she lost her daughter here in this case, and how she felt an urge to keep carrying on her legacy, right? So this is how the author felt. I wrote these words almost 10 years to the day since my 17-year-old daughter was killed by a distracted driver. In the hours after death, her stepfather and I began conceptualizing an organization in our daughter's name. We felt strongly, almost instinctively, that we had to make some good from our tragedy, to make her life and her death count. So, this is how they wanted to carry on her daughter's legacy. So, they wanted to do something to prevent such stuff from happening again, right? They tried creating an organization. So, this was their form of manifesting her legacy. Gracie was so much more than the victim of a fatal car crash. Undeniably, she was that too. This fact carried a near magnetic pull. Wasn't it my job to prevent more senseless deaths like her? A resounding yes pounding in my chest, more questions churned. How do I carry her story forward? Talking about the legacy. How do I honor her? I wrestled mightily with ambivalence about what to do. I was wary about engaging in self driving advocacy because if we went that route, our daughter's memory would be reduced to that of a girl who died in a car crash. I also worried that repeatedly revisiting her death would keep me in a painfully dark and ugly place, compounding my daily suffering. So you can see the various questions popping up in the author's head, right? Do I try to keep carrying on a legacy in the form of an organization? It felt like a need. It felt like something she had to do to prevent death like hers. But it also brought up questions like, am I too am I too bound up in this event that I can't move on from it? And working for this like distracted drivers problem, will it just reduce her memory to just a victim? So she did not want her daughter to be reduced to only such a single event. She was more than what ended her life. Around this time, I attended a survivors panel organized by the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance. Each panelist offered suggestions for coping with the violent death of a loved one. One of the panelists, the brother of a murdered young man, paused during his remarks, sighed heavily, and said, "And whatever you do, don't start another fucking foundation. Let the professionals do that. Your job is to take care of yourselves." His emphatic statement tapped right into my ambivalence. So, you can see the author went to this Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance and learned about one of the POVs from a panelist where he said, do not start activism, do not find another professional, let the professionals do that. And this was something that caught the author's attention. His words offer one way to think. The bereaved activist mother, Mamie Till Mobley, shows us another. So the two ways of thinking about it are shown here. When a black teen son Emmett was abducted, tortured, and lynched in Mississippi, she insisted that his casket remain open so that the world can see what they did to my baby. Her act is often credited with launching the civil rights movement in 1955. So, the author writes about two different ways of thinking where and a different contrary situation to what the brother of the murdered young man as a panelist said. Like sometimes going in towards activism, sometimes showing the world signals like insisted that his casket remain open can have positive effects on the society and the support systems we have in our current society, right? It launched the civil rights movement in 1955, for example. I thought about the tragically endless stream of current day till moblies, all those black mothers of children shot dead by the police will become overnight a temporary fascination, as the struggle to find words in a sea of microphones flanked by Ben Crump and Rev Al Sharpton. I wonder if, given the opportunity, these mothers would prefer to grieve privately, like me, buried under the duvet, scrolling through family videos and weeping. Is this instantaneous activist role their choice? Do they feel exploited, their private pain transformed into public spectacle? Doesn't reliving the story of their tragedy compound their trauma? Are they wary of turning their pain into purpose? Would they rather someone ready their bed? So all these questions pop up in the author's mind. What would they have preferred, right? Like they were pushed seemingly into this world of activism and world of virtue signaling for the society, right? But what they would really personally want is still a mystery to the author. I'm a grieving parent. I'm also a scholar of social movements. So I took my grief and questions. Instead of starting that foundation, I did what I do. Together with my students, I collected data and used it to make sense of who, why, what, when, and how of grief induced activism. While traumatic loss is ubiquitous, our productive engagement with its consequences lags far behind. There is little systematic investigation into how trauma shapes activism, even while activist efforts flourish in these diverse areas, from gun law reform to police brutality to opioid addiction, suicide, COVID 19, and all other. I agree with the writer activist Malkia Davis Cyril, who insists to have a movement that breathes, you must build a movement with the capacity to grieve. If it's true that grief is love with nowhere to go, then activism provides a place for that love. Accidental activism agitates for a better change tomorrow. So the author points out that there is still a gap between like between the in the study of how grief shapes and starts motivates activism and what is their effect on the society. And this is a beautiful line here to if grief is a love with nowhere to go, activism provides a place for that love. So this shows how that grief is such a motivation for activism to start. Yeah, so but it is wider than that. It makes meaning and instills purpose. It knits people into communities and it enables those living with a hole in their hearts to remain in relationship with loved ones lost. So, like when you start, when bereaved people start activism or start organizations with the idea of carrying on the legacy of their loved one, there is some kind of feeling that we are doing what they could not have, what couldn't do, or doing in the memory of them, right? So this is they hold on to their loved ones in some way or the other. So this is what she means. But transforming their grief into grievance, they carve a sustainable path forward in the interminable wilderness of traumatic grief. Rather than letting go, bereaved activists are holding on, and they are challenging us all to sit with painful truths instead of running from them. So this is an idea against the modern Western media approach of closure, right? They are facing their painful truth instead of running from them, and they are converting their grief into some kind of community. They are finding people with similar experiences and stuff, and trying to hold on to the ones they love through some way or the other. To do my research, I sought out grief and trauma induced activists, borrowing from the moniker that bereaved activist Kim Witzak claims for herself, the accidental advocate. These driven those driven to establish charities, organize fundraisers, and launch awareness campaigns to address the cause of death and in all their loved ones' names. So, see, the author borrows the moniker from Kim Witzak, and since all accidents and death can happen is an accident, and they start this activism as a form of this accident. So, the author terms all these people who starts activism after some kind of tragedy accidental activists. So that was the reason. Moving on to the next chapter, the author starts talking about one of the people she surveyed or interviewed. Jenny Stanley is among those interviewed. She lost her 6-year-old daughter Sydney when she climbed in the family car parked in the driveway by herself. Sydney could not get back out and no one could find her until she was dead of heat stroke. Her mother has become a national authority on the fatal danger of hot cars. My student and I spoke to people who now, in the wake of their traumatic loss, became experts in hazing, partner violence, suicide, drug addiction, medical errors of various kind, hospitally acquired infections, natural disasters, car and truck crashes, illness, pulmonary embolisms linked to hormonal birth control use. This list, which I often recite, invariably generates head shaking because it captures our worst fear come to life and death. So the author talks about various reasons why, why loved ones may start activism, like various reasons of death and what we fear in our life, other reasons which start this stuff, right? These losses are preventable and thus impossible for most to rationalize. Even especially for the bereaved parents, they are also a direct affront to the natural order of things, so much so that we lack a common term from bereaved parent. So the author wants to portray through this line that this stuff is something that we can avoid, right? And everyone who starts activism through such tragic loss are of the have the mentality that what happened to my family members should not happen with others. So this is the mentality that they start with, that they are motivated by. Some of those interviewed are familiar, such as Candace Lightner, founder of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Judy Shepard, mother of Matthew Shepard, and Susan Bro, mother of Heather Heyer, both victims of high-profile hate crimes, and Cindy Sheehan, who reignited the anti-war movement in US in the early 2000s after her son Casey Sheehan was killed in the war in Iraq. Others are connected to events that continue to grab national attention, such as parents of children murdered in mass shootings in Uvalde, Texas 2022, Parkland, Florida 2018, Newtown, Connecticut in 2012, and in Aurora, Colorado 2012. Others are still members of the Say Her Name Mothers Network, family of black women and girls killed by police. So various examples from various cases, various ways and various profiles. The accidental activists long for deep cultural recognition of loss. Through their work, they make their grief legible in a culture that turns away from their pain. As activists, they can grieve out loud. Their activism is a potent means of survival. When others are pressing them to let go, they use their activism to hold on. So they want to have a so they want to convert their loss or tragedy to a deeper cultural meaning, right? They do not want to reduce their loved ones to just a single event. They want to prevent that event from happening later as well, right? They want to hold on to that event as a means of survival. They do not want to move on, and this creates a cultural narrative in turn. The accidental activists taught me how they hold on in three interrelated ways. First, through their activism, they craft a purpose that gives shape and meaning to their lives. Second, their activism connects them with supportive community of other bereaved people. And third, as activists, they continue their role, parent, sibling, partner, and dead loved one. So this paragraph says how they hold on in three ways. They start their activism through a motivation like the motivation of starting the activist organization is something like we do not want it to happen again, so such stuff. And this motivation brings in similar people that have faced similar consequences and are bereaved as well. And the third is like they continue to think that they are attached to their loved ones or their lost ones in some form of way. So these are the three ways. Their lessons are also also point us toward a new way of thinking about grief. Grief is not a problem to be solved, but rather an emotional reality that demands acknowledgement. There's a great statement here. As the psychiatrist Judith Herman asserts in Truth and Repair, trauma is a social problem, not an individual one. It requires collective and sustained acknowledgement. So grief is not something that we move on from, right? So it is something that stays with us and we need to acknowledge it. While on a college service trip to Haitian orphanage in 2010, Brittany Gengel was killed in a catastrophic earthquake. Just hours before the quake hit, Brittany texted her mom with her wish to someday return to Haiti and set up her own orphanage. Soon after Brittany's death, the Gengel family found the Be Like Brit Foundation, realizing Brittany's vision. The orphanage is shaped in the letter B for Brit, best visible from the sky. So This is a case where the parents wanted to carry on their daughter's legacy, and this created this foundation that to honor her wishes. In the interview, Britney's dad Len shared, "For me, continuing the activism has given a death meaning. Without it, it feels completely senseless. I can make no sense of it. But with it, it helps me to make some sense of a devastating and senseless death. That if her death and her life can in any way help other people, it has helped thousands and continues to help thousands. It helps me with my grief and about finding purpose and meaning. And if there can be meaning from her death, it's much easier to hold." So, it's in his vision that if there is any meaning to made from her death and in any way they can carry on her legacy, it's much easier to hold on to that. Like Len says, if there can be meaning, it's much easier to hold. These accidental activists are crafting purpose, searching for meaning, what David Kessler calls the sixth stage of grief. To be clear, they are not seeking a meaning for the death, but rather a way to transform their pain into purpose. Yeah, so that's another way, another very great line. Like they do not look for meaning in the deaths, right? Like they do not see that it was a single event that they should do this because of their death, right? But it is a transformative event that like converted their pain into some kind of purpose, a process that restores much needed control for the traumatized. As Nicole Hockley, the mother of one of the victims of Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, explained, "What happened? The murder of my youngest son was not something I could control. What happened? That was my choice. What happened after that was my choice." So, yeah. Hockley, now a nationally recognized expert on school safety, chose to co-found the Sandy Hook Promise Foundation to prevent school-based violence. She told me that every morning when she rises, she kisses the urn that holds her son Dylan's ashes. This daily act renews her purpose and enables her to live with unrelenting pain of her son's senseless murder. So these kind of beliefs around what moves her is individual, is different for everyone, right? But the same thing is that they have found a meaning and they have found something that motivates them to do stuff every day. So that is the same thing in everyone. The accidental activists expressed frustration because their trauma and grief often went unacknowledged. They complained about family gatherings, for instance, where the person goes missing unnamed. They told tales of running into old friends who breezily asked, "What's new? Everything good?" without so much as a nod to the loss they are bearing. So, what's a bereaved person do? In short, find others who share your experience. So, this part tells about how, like, the frustration people feel when their grief is not acknowledged, right? And the best way is to find people who have been through similar experience through similar tragedy, and they are the ones that can understand. And forging community does just that. Forging community means finding that soft place to land, a phrase I gratefully adopt from Sandy and Lonnie Phillips, who founded Survivors Empowered after their daughter Jessica Redfield Garvey was murdered in 2012 mass shooting in a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. In 2014, Tanisha Anderson was in the midst of what family members call one of her bad days, and when her brother called 911 for mental health support. When the police arrived, she panicked and ran into the street. The police cuffed and forced her onto the pavement outside her home in Cleveland. As an officer kneeled on her back, Tanisha died of a heart attack. Her death was determined a homicide. So this is one of the cases that because of ignorance and there was a life lost, and this can also be a moment to start activism or accidental activism in the author's work, and it definitely did. Tanisha's mother, Cassandra Johnson, was a proud member of the Say Her Name Mothers Network until her own death in 2021. Cassandra helps us understand the healing powers of the network, directly challenging the assumption that being encircled by others who also suffers compounds our misery. So, Cassandra challenged the notion that if we spend more time with people who are grieving, it compounds our own misery, right? But it's not the case. We can share. Those are the people that truly understand grief, and those are the people that truly understand what the situation you're in, right? So that is a wrong notion which she helped challenge. In a video posted on the Say Her Name website through tears, she shared, oddly as it may sound, to be around these mothers makes you feel better. Most people they might say, "Oh, I know how you feel." No, you don't. So to be around mothers that really do makes you feel a lot better, as oddly it may sound. We collected dozens of comments like Cassandra's for bereaved activists of color once they located their purpose. Finding community was especially important. Activists describe how they forge new connections through activism at fundraisers, legislative strategy sessions, lobbying days, and all other stuff. It was in these spaces where they felt most at home, or as one bereaved activist put it, where I could actually breathe. Activism enabled them to connect with others who got it, and these linkages enabled them to keep going. So that this talks about all the stuff that activism can help you with, like forging new connections, helping you to keep going in moments where the going gets really tough, and actually sharing your thoughts and grief with other people who really understand you, and not like some sympathy, like people who show sympathy or pity, right? Because these people have been through the same thing you have. The state of grieving is fertile ground for activism, but it needs community to sustain and grow. Yeah. Okay, moving on. The greatest fear of the bereaved is that their dead loved ones will be forgotten. To resist this slow erasure, the activists assume the role of caretaker of their loved one's legacy. Some, like the Engel family, do this by continuing their unfinished projects or realizing goals that their premature deaths prohibited, as we mentioned before. Many also work to control the narrative of their loved one's life and death, especially when the circumstances of their death are ripe for victim blaming, such as in the case of police involved murders or drug overdoses. Activists will, for example, work to circulate images of their loved ones that challenge racist assumptions of thugs and instead represent their deceased as respectable and productive members of community. So, different cultural narratives and different social imageries are created based on these events as well, right? In some cases, surviving loved ones frame their death as a catalyst for change. As George Floyd's young daughter Gianna shouted at a press event, "Daddy changed the world." Ray Ann Gruber travels the country speaking to fraternities, sororities about the dangers of hazing. She lost her son Max to a hazing incident in the first weeks of college at Louisiana State University. She exclaimed, "I want every member of the fraternity to know Max's name." The impulse is yet again is for death to mean something. Through storytelling and advocacy, relational bonds are maintained. So this provides various examples to the points mentioned above. Throughout this work, the activists often speak of the dead in a present tense and endow them with the capacity to guide the work of the living. For example, Lori lost her teen daughter Alyssa when she and 16 others were shot dead at Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School in Parkland. Is now a school board member and founder of NGO Make Our Schools Safe. Declares Alyssa still is making an impact and saving lives. So talking about dead loved ones in the present tense also shows that they try to carry on the legacies, and they also think that they are still making a difference, right? What's more, for those left behind, especially bereaved parents, there is a persistent sense of obligation, amplified for those carrying regret. As Drew West, who lost her daughter Julia West Ross to a pulmonary embolism linked to birth control, has since become a fierce health advocate. Now explained, "I am trying to do for others what I wish someone had done for my daughter." What I told earlier. They feel a need to do something to prevent deaths that can be prevented. Now explained, "I am trying to." Importantly, they did not experience the responsibility as a burden, but as a means to maintain connection. The bereaved activists are clear that they are not ready to end the relationship with their loved ones. Fundraising for a foundation, drafting, and all this other stuff can invoke their loved ones in socially acceptable ways. In this context, they can be still Gracie's mom or Woody's wife. They actually challenge the very finality of death, but there may be downsides to accidental activism. Let's get into those. Sabrina Fulton, the mother of Travion Martin, reflected on her highly visible activism fighting for a justice for son. offered this in a documentary Rest in Power, the Trayvon Martin story. She said that had the tragedy not been so public, I could have been given more time to grieve, but she did not have that privilege. The author now tells that everyone has the right to grieve, right? So that is something that is our fundamental right, and taking that away from someone is not like common, or is not something that's seen in a good light. But the culture we have in our modern day society is something very grief averse. We do not have the structures, social structures to support people grieving. Yeah. So Fulton's experience highlight how broken our systems of support are for the bereaved. We cannot forget that these activists are forced in the horrible crucible of their traumatic losses. They are transformed overnight and they need support. So the suddenness and uh, these tragedies are very quick and sudden, right? So they need time to transform overnight. They are not, they transform overnight, and they need support to be fully fledged activists and stuff like that, right? In 2016, Corinne Gaines, a 23-year-old hairstylist and the mother of two young children, was shot to death. Her 5-year-old son Cody, was also shot but survived. Corinne's brother posted a memorial video in Twitter with the comment, "I miss her so much." Her mother retweeted the video with the poignant rejoinder, "We are not okay." These few words are a portal to the world of the bereaved who struggle against the culture of grief aversion and rush to closure. Increasingly, we pathologize grief, as seen in the latest edition of DSM-5. It now includes a controversial new diagnosis, prolonged grief disorder. So grief is seen more like a disease or a disorder to be treated, right, rather than an emotion to be acknowledged. Yet there are consequences for our chronic discomfort with grief, even when trauma paradoxically gains traction in an ever-widening collection of narratives surrounding us. Traumatic grief is omnipresent in film and other forms of media. It's so ubiquitous, writes Parul Sahgal in New Yorker 2022, that the trauma plot has been reduced to a trope. So the idea of grief and trauma has been reduced to media buzzwords and has been like perverted by media buzzwords, right? And so the systems we have are not enough to support the actually grieving. The discomfort manifests in the rush to end grief to solve it. We call this closure, and it is without a doubt the dominant discourse of grieving. Yet the researcher of family stress and ambiguous loss Pauline Boss and the sociologist Nancy Burns both assert that chasing closure is counterproductive. So this again says about that the idea of closure is not something that's very natural and is counterproductive. Every one of the individuals interviewed for my study categorically, emphatically refused the goal of closure. So it is being seen in negative light by all of those surveyed, right? They laughed, rolled their eyes, shook their heads, threw up in their hands. West, whose daughter died from an hormonal contraceptive side effect, put it with closure is for cupboards, then why do people assume we want it and need it? In short, others want us to find closures. Others think that grief has an expiration date. And I walk into a room and I still make people. So the idea of closure is not is being adopted by the outside world and people who are not actually attached to that community or the grief, right? The people who actually face grief due to loss of their loved ones are not the ones who actually believed in the idea of closure. So what do they tell us? In short, we need to resist the cultural aversion to grief, and we need to stop pushing closure as that salve that will heal the broken heart. Obviously, the moves are not repairs. Instead, they are invalidations of true suffering, and they block honest reckoning. When bad things happen, we struggle with what to do, what to say. People with pity is a distancing move. So yeah, this paragraph again tells us that pity and sympathy is not something that grieving people want, right? They want acknowledgement that they are grieving, that they have lost someone. Yeah, silver lining it, according to Brown here, does not help. Grief is a powerful, necessary, enduring. When we embrace grief in our social movements, we inch closer to accountability and justice. David Cyril's question hits the mark. What becomes possible when movements are brought healthfully to grief? And what can we do to support leaders, organizations, movements to get here? So the very valid questions brought up here. Now, the author talks about bereaved people of color because it is a very pressing issue in today's world. For those lacking privilege, angry shouts capture attention, but quiet tears do not. So, activism or accidental activism in this case is very much required. Racism erases some sort of trauma, often rationalized by victim blaming. At the same time, it renders stories of black and brown death as sources of prurient entertainment. However, what bereaved families and friends of all races want is accountability. What we all want, right? Banded together with others who experience similar traumatic losses, they are emboldened to fight for the justice owed. At the same time, the author also thinks about the other perspective that the panelist said, whose brother was murdered, who advised against founding another fucking foundation. Is activism in fact a road that should be less traveled? Can we build an emotionally literate and community minded world where the bereaved are held and heard without having to do extraordinary things? So another way of looking at it, like we should change our society and build better support systems, right? So that we do not need to engage in activism to find that community, to find that acknowledgement. Talks about a tweet that underlines this question. After the massacre in Uvalde, Texas, she wrote, one of the biggest mistakes made in covering uniquely United States an epidemic of gun violence is the demand for a tragedy to triumph narrative because the reality is too hard. So this talks about how gun violence is not shown in an entirely negative light, right? It's shown in a tragedy to triumph narrative, and we need to talk about its challenges and hardships more to make some kind of effect on it. What needs to change? The author has no clear prescriptions other than this. Meet the grieving where they are at, especially when that place makes you uncomfortable and even fearful. And when you encounter an accidental activist, remember that even though they are carrying the grief, it does not mean it's not heavy. Offer to help, show up, contribute, learn, and pass on the lessons. So, great advice by the author. And then she goes on to a chapter about herself. What about me? I hesitate to call myself an accidental activist, certainly in comparison with the people I've met through my work. So, the author definitely does not consider herself to be an accidental activist because the stuff she has done for in the sake of activism is not something she considers to be at par with the people she have met. While we have made some modest efforts to raise awareness about distracted driving, our work honoring Gracie has focused on what brought joy in her life. We set up scholarship for skaters. We have funded a youth public art project. Set up middle and high school student designed beautiful banners that line our main street every spring since 2016. Each banner includes the line made possible by the family of Gracie James, and when I see that, my feelings are complicated. So it's not entirely good read because they are still grieving and they are still sad about the loss, but they also feel pride, longing, sorrow, everything together. If it helps me in but it helps her in some way to stay connected to their daughter. That's the main thing. But it also brings up some very serious questions like, should they fund this project indefinitely? Are they compounding their sorrows? Because their daughter is gone forever, right? And if she's seeking comfort in the wrong place, so these questions also pop up. But I should not have to translate my grief into grievance or public art or skating scholarships to be heard or seen. I was profoundly altered at after her birth, and more profoundly after her death. Who is willing to witness my pain without expectation or judgment or worse, shrinking away? Who will see and hear yours? After all, grief is coming for all. So, quite a questioning and ending for the passage, right? Because there are a lot of questions left unanswered, lot of various truths given your way. Like every grief is coming for us all, and there is still a need for people that can acknowledge you, and the author is still looking for that as well, I feel like. So yeah, great passage on grief and how it may turn into grievance and why it does and all that. Thanks.